Graphy, and a near accidental realization of a hidden talent for self-expression through line and color. Only this can explain Gurudev Tagore's emergence as a painter in old age. The Joroshenko house of the Tagore family in those days was a cloistered world of music, literary debate, and the pursuit of excellence. And yet, this was a stifling atmosphere for young Rabindranath, and even as a young boy, he had to be content with having his visual imagination restricted to word pictures. This was the time of the fin de siècle, and the 20th century was just a few years away. On this scene of a household resounding to literary jousting, music and drama, came an Italian art teacher who started giving lessons in painting to Gaganendranath Tagore. It was in 1893 that Tagore gave his first hint of dabbling with painting in a letter to his niece Indira. And in these years he had been exchanging by post riddles and pictures with his cousins while holidaying in Shimla. On Tagore's return from the West in 1917, the years when he had already become a literary celebrity, the idea came to him to start his own art school at Shantiniketan with Nandalal Bose as its director. It was during these days of 1919 that Rabindranath Tagore began to deliberately and consciously take interest in graphic art as a medium of self-expression.
It was in the year 1924 that a landmark event in Rabindranath Tagore's development as an artist took place. While on a sea voyage to South America, he was taken violently ill. He spent this depressing period on board ship by writing Puravi. It was while writing Puravi that Tagore experienced apparitions of non-deliberate origin. By a strange act of cognition, given only to great seers, Tagore arrived at the philosophy of the poet-painters of China. That when you enjoy yourself with the poems, you find pictures in them. And when looking at the pictures, you find in them poems.
It was Tagore's hostess in Buenos Aires, Victoria Ocampo, who one morning in 1924, I think it was, when looking at his drawings, got the surprise of her life. It's the work of a mature artist, she said. Tagore came back to India in 1925, and by 1928, he seems to have taken with all the fervor of a missionary with a borrowed life to picture making in right earnest.
Rabindranath, in a letter to his friend Rani Mahanalobis, wrote, "I have almost managed to forget that there used to be a time when I wrote poetry. The subject matter of a poem can be traced back to some dim thought in the mind. While painting, however, the process adopted by me is quite the reverse. First, there is the hint of a line. Then the line becomes a form. The more pronounced the form, the more clear becomes the picture of my conception. This creation of form is an endless wonder. It is far more exciting when the mind is seized of something outside of it, some compulsive surprise element, gradually assuming an understandable form." By the year 1930, when the first exhibition of Tagore was presented in Paris, then England, Germany, Denmark, he had created a prodigious output of almost 2,000 drawings and paintings.
In 1939-40, Gurudev gave us a deep insight into his art. It is my doodles that assume some forms. Art is a ceaseless search for perception. Creation is not repetition.
Rabindranath Tagore, as an exponent of graphic art, made a deep and an abiding impact on Henri Bidou, a Parisian critic. At the time of his Paris exhibition at the Galerie Pigalle in May 1930, according to Bidou, Rabindranath claimed that there was no connection between his work as a poet and his work as a painter. What then is the truth?
Rabindranath's verses communicate something that's seen or created. On the contrary, once he becomes a painter, at the exact moment that others begin to copy, Rabindranath ceases to copy.
So in other words, in producing his poetry, Rabindranath worked as a painter, and now that he was a painter, he worked like a poet. The whole of this genre of Rabindranath's work is on the borderline of two sciences or two arts.
Tagore created pure painting, absolutely sincere and wholly uninfluenced by our studio customs. Apart from accidental resemblances and the osmosis of the time spirit, it would be a mistake to try and relate his work as an artist to any contemporary movement of those times.
Rabindranath Tagore's painting is a personal, original phenomenon. What made it great art was its genuinely naive expression, an extraordinary evidence of eternal youth, persistent in a whole
with the affairs of the Indian Society of Oriental Art in Calcutta in the early years of this century that I first met Gaganendranath Tagore. I, right from the first, fell a victim to, an unwilling victim, to the spell that he cast, not of intention, but of necessity, upon all those who came within the orbit of his personality.
Art in the second half of 19th century India was an era of historical drawings and illustrations, for traditional painting had fallen into a rigid frame. It was in these times that the Tagore family, having been the center of the Bengal Renaissance, threw up a genius like Gaganendranath Tagore, a son of Rabindranath's cousin.
The successive stages of Gaganendranath's artistic career are marked by a great originality of conception and execution of a myriad variety of themes in many styles and mediums. In the Jorasanko house, Gaganendranath came into contact with the Japanese artists Taikwan and Hishida, exponents of the Okakura's Bijitsu school. The Japanese influence on Gaganendranath is seen in the series of illustrations that he did for Rabindranath Tagore's Jivan Smriti in 1912. It was about this time, in 1907, that the Indian Society of Oriental Art was born. Gaganendranath was its moving spirit, and his versatile genius found an outlet in crafts, designing, dresses, and interiors.
It was during the years 1916 to 1918 that Gaganendranath made those remarkable satirical cartoons that found their way to newspapers by litho. Turmoil in the field of art and cultural conflicts were the themes of these cartoons. Some of the famous cartoons were The Dance, Human Scream, Chemical Scream Out, and Deficit.
It is, however, Gaganendranath's work as a landscape painter in those early years that is truly remarkable. He sought to create atmosphere and not to depict objects in nature. The plains of Bengal, the mountains and woods in Ranchi and Hazaribagh inspired him to do some remarkable studies. Unlike any of his contemporaries, Gaganendranath was as much inspired by nature as by the scenes of Calcutta. These brush and ink works are based on the Japanese premise that the nature of the ink is different from the nature of the brush.
Gaganendranath was probably conversant with the different European schools dedicated to experimentation in abstract art. His work in the Cubist style, however, had very little in common with French Cubism.
It might be interesting for us to probe into the reasons for Gaganendranath leaning towards so-called abstract art in his later career. The main reason, to my mind, is that Gaganendranath was never interested in the concept of translating mental feelings and spiritual ideas into a terminology of painting. As such, he was able to find the true outlet for his talents in what can loosely be termed abstract forms. Thus, Gaganendranath was able to develop a style that was an amalgamation of the concrete and the abstract. Gaganendranath's work in the Cubist style has very little in common with French Cubism because he kept his paintings confined within two dimensions, length and breadth. In his so-called Cubist paintings, he aimed at creating a two-dimensional surface. It is in his second phase of experiments that we find Gaganendranath concerned not so much with the depiction of visible forms and shapes as with the transformation of the visible and real. In other words, the angle of vision from which these studies were made, reflections of light received more importance than the manner of presentation of form. The brightness of color radiating in these paintings of Gaganendranath is extraordinary. Such clear expression of visual inspiration is rare in modern art. Gaganendranath Tagore did not belong to the school of painting associated with Rabindranath, or indeed any other school. He tried and succeeded in assimilating various trends. In his Cubist and generally so-called abstract paintings, Gaganendranath was the first amongst Indian artists of his time to grasp, understand, and used the medium of the art of the West in those years. Thus it is that, having opened his mind's eye to all influences, Gaganendranath was able to free himself completely from the tradition and technique of art being practiced in the Calcutta of those days.
One thing stands out in Gaganendranath's remarkable artistic career. His artistic creation was individualistic. The ease with which he could transform any conventional form into a significant composition without any harkening back to themes of poetry, legend, or sentiment proved again and again that though Gaganendranath was no purist of any formal school, the profundity of psychological content in his paintings owed nothing to extraneous non-pictorial elements. If we judge Gaganendranath against the backdrop of the international art scene of 5 and 6 decades ago, we'll have little problem in seeing the originality of his work and of his place in the art history of the 20th century. An Indian Cezanne or a unique genius experimenting in pure form? How are we to judge Jamini Roy? Perhaps an insight into his ethnic antecedents will reveal something. In the Bankura district of West Bengal, there is a remote village called Baliator, where Jamini Roy was born in the year 1887. The rocky escarpment of East Bihar meets the plain of the Ganga Delta here, and in this crucible of cultures, many tribal and ethnic groups mingled. Being essentially a tribal area, Bankura district has an intense local culture with its roots way back in pre-Aryan and Buddhist times.
Craftsmen of Jamini's village, the potters, the weavers, the painters of scrolls and putts, the makers of puja images, the makers of dolls, must have inspired him and aroused in him an abiding involvement with form and design.
When Jamini Roy was 16 years of age, his father sent him to Calcutta to study at the Government School of Art. Here, in the Government School of Art, Jamini Roy learned all the stages of academic art, and by the time he completed his studies, he had become a professionally known painter in the academic medium. Jamini Roy's mastery of the European academic painting style is clearly revealed in his self-portrait.
The decisive moment in Jamini Roy's career arrived when he was 34 years old, when he decided that he could no longer go on painting in the European academic manner. Neither could he go back to the revivalist techniques of the distinguished painters of the Bengal of those times. So, Jamini Roy went back to his roots.
In other words, the basic forms of folk art gave Jamini Roy the supreme chance of finding a personal medium of expression.
Jamini Roy bent the Patwa style to suit his own needs and proved that he could press into service, remodel, restructure any tradition for making his own style.
Made replicas of Kali Ghat putts, but they were hardly identical, in spite of the fact that the models were the same.
He made it clear that he could freely replace the traditional character of line and color to suit his own purpose, which a traditional Patwa could never have dared to do. Being an urbane, self-conscious painter, Jamini Roy showed his passion for experimentation. Thus, the Bengal folk art schemata fitted in with Jamini Roy's quest for evolving his personal style. It is highly possible that Jamini Roy's village background, tempered by his training at the Calcutta Art College, enabled him to have more in common with the Kalighat medium. The abundant, deep, and strong contour of Kalighat influenced Jamini Roy, and he chose it to base some of his most famous paintings, wherein he evolves a new approach to color, line, and form. Similarly, Jamini Roy's genius bent the patwa to his style, showing a sensitivity far beyond the field of unlettered patwa painters.
Jamini Roy's better-known paintings like the Santal Dance, the Santal Boy, and paintings centered around the theme of the balls reveal the artist's long struggle to arrive at pure form.
Only in the 30s in Calcutta, an atmosphere of discourse had been created, and there was open discussion on various contemporary schools of European painting. In those days, many artists felt free to gain by the experience of Western artists.
So, in other words, Jamini Roy could possibly have turned towards post-impressionism and Picasso for inspiration?
Yes, and here, in Picasso's work and in that of others, Jamini Da found confirmation of his own conviction that there was need to arrive at quintessential form. And his painting, Bengali Woman, shows this.
In other words, it is quite possible that this new approach to form arrived at by Jamini Roy through a process of conscious cerebration and a conviction that there was an equivalence between the various elements of folk sensibility and the European art movements of that time?
This struggle reaches its pinnacle in Jamini Roy's Christ. He seems to have forgotten his folk mannerisms. There is near total, elemental starkness.
Jamini Roy considered himself a simple patwa painter, painting for a specific purpose, to bring through his art a calmness of spirit and tranquility to whomsoever beheld his work. From this prime precept flowed the essential characteristics of Jamini Roy's art: avoidance of any disturbing form in the paintings, and to repeat the pictorial motif extensively.
His origin from the folk soil reinforced Jamini Da's belief that there was no uniqueness or preciousness associated with an art object. He sought to remove all traces of his personality from his work. Easy communicability was the hallmark of his work. In his eventful artistic career, Jamini Roy moved from reality expressed by quality of appearance to beauty expressed by quality of line and color.
Thus, in the final analysis, the Bengal folk art syndrome fitted in with his quest for evolving his own style. Jamini Roy was at times postulating his own view of art against much practiced art trends of his time, and in the process, he drew liberally from the Bengal folk traditions and others as well.
Unique amongst the modern painters of India, Jamini Roy's achievement in always solving the formalistic problems of his art, almost single-handedly, gives him a unique and remarkable position in the art history of this century.
Amrita Shergill in her life represents the dilemma of the 20th century Indian artist, the perpetual oscillation between the alluring magnetism of traditional Indian art and the dynamism of modern European art. But how do you relate this standpoint with Amrita Shergill's career as an artist? Amrita, the child of an Indian father and a Hungarian mother, spent her early years in Hungary and came to India when she was 8 years old. In 1927, she had been in India for 6 years, and her drawings and watercolors were all in the genre of the European school of art. All the great names of European painting had done their work and generated controversies many years before. As such, Amrita's work of this period seems untouched by any art currents. She produced some good academic paintings, but it was during her 5-year stay in Paris from 1929 to 34 that Amrita got into the Parisian world of art. Working first at the Grand Chaumière under Pierre Voyant, and then later at the École des Beaux-Arts under Lucien Simon, Amrita did a considerable body of work consisting of sketches and drawings. From 1930, when she took to painting in oil, she created many works of academic competence. But Amrita had still not discovered her forte, nor was she in contact with any of the various schools. Her paintings of that period include the nude, young girls, study of models, amongst others. Amrita returned to India in the end of 1934, and after a few months spent in her ancestral home, she came to Simla. Overnight in Simla, Amrita became the center of attention with the elite who had descended upon the summer capital of India. In Simla, Amrita painted a large number of portraits, and in these she moved from the modeling of the face in terms of light and shade towards more simplified, flat planes. In the portraits done at Simla, like the one of Malcolm Muggeridge, we see the mingling of the influences of Cezanne and Gauguin, distinctly visible in the organization of forms and the splendor of colors. November 1936, Amrita arrived in Bombay and was overwhelmed with her first encounter with the Kangra, Basholi and Rajput paintings in the Prince of Wales Museum. The brilliant colors of these paintings brought a sea change in Amrita's palette, away from the somber colors of European painting. From Bombay, Amrita went to Ajanta and Ellora. She exclaimed in a letter, "For the first time since my return to India, I have learned something from somebody else's work." 5 paintings reveal the open extent of the Ajanta influence. Village Girl,
brahmacharis, South Indian villagers going to market, bride's toilet. The sensuous humanism of the Ajanta masters and the studied disposition of masses, the rich and mellow color play, left Amrita in a dilemma again as she groped for her own individual style.
So it is quite clear that Amrita's return to India cannot quite compare with Goguet's return to faraway Tahiti.
Yes, that's true. Because in India, she returned to a mixture of middle-class, snobbish, drab urban society, whereas all around her was this vast culture of rural India. It created mixed feelings inside her heart, and the results are evident in the paintings of that time. In 1938, while on a visit to Hungary, Amrita Shergill curiously reverted to the European mannerisms in her painting. In her quandary, she found Bruegel as coming nearest to her style, which was being haunted by the Mughal Rajput paintings. Upon her return to India in 1939, Amrita seems to have made a start where she left off. This was a period of great introspection for Amrita. She was resolving her dilemma by changing the stress on human quality to the pictorial and rendering it in the more naive and naturalistic style of the Rajput and Mughal miniatures. Obviously, in her painting of this period, she was resolving the dilemma of style, and therefore in these paintings, individualities of the figures disappear like in the miniatures, and they become just mute components in a complex.